Okay, so the presentation is looking to some extent at the Delphi approach to doing qualitative research, and also talking about a project that I've done, but basically with John Lancaster and Susan Guthrie, who were the people that did most of the work itself. It was something that was funded by Health Education Northwest, and it's looking at developing competence in dysphagia for new graduates. That was what the project was about in the first place. Just looking at Delphi in the first place, it's said to be characterised as a method for structuring groups' communication process so that you can get everybody in the group to talk to each other and deal with a complex question. It was first actually used in the defence industry in the USA in the 1950s. And so it didn't take off as something very popular for quite a long time after that, because it was seen as being to do with the military. The first I came across it was in an expert group, when I was a member of an expert group, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when Anna van der Gaag, who is a speech and language therapist who's well known to people in the UK, was doing some work on developing a model of competence for speech and language therapists. And she used the Delphi technique as part of that. The actual process is a group consultation method. Linstone and Turruff are the people that have done most of the writing on it from the point of view of the way that we went about doing things. And their original book was in 1975. We've got it as an e-book here. So you can download a 2002 version of the book, and there is 2011 publication as well. And other work that's also been done is, I can't quite see that, sorry. There are other authors that are doing that as well. So what happens is, first of all, you get an expert panel that generates topic areas. The original items generated are circulated to other experts who are usually identified by the original group for response and comment. And then the returned comments are integrated into the original list and recirculated. So it's a cyclical thing where everybody gets to know not only what people have said, but why they've said it in a second round, or possibly in a third or fourth round, although we didn't do 3 and 4 rounds. And so the cycle continues until consensus is reached. And consensus level has to be agreed beforehand. So it might be quite a low consensus level. You might get something like 60%. You might get anything up to 100%. We went for 75, which was within the boundaries of what Linstone and Turruff were suggesting. Just going back to that slide, sorry. Not everybody who's called an expert needs to be somebody that's at the top end of their profession. An expert is somebody that knows what they're talking about in that particular context. So a student might be an expert if you're asking them about student experience. A speech and language therapist if you're asking them about speech and language therapy. So it doesn't have to be somebody that's at the top of whatever tree they happen to be at. So what we're looking at is this particular project, which is developing dysphagia competency in speech and language therapy graduates, new graduates, in dysphagia, and that is eating, drinking and swallowing difficulties for those of you that aren't speech and language therapists. If you just bear with me 1 second. So we had 3 phases to the project, and I'll talk through each of these because they all built up towards the actual Delphi that we were talking about. First of all, there was a literature review and expert interviews. Secondly, there was a survey of current practice and of students' views of current practice in terms of how they got their dysphagia information. And then developing the developing the consensus for competency development, which was the Delphi part of the study. And we ended up with a model of competency development, and we also ended up with brochures, which I've got here, and are also on a website which is on the ends of these slides so that people can access those brochures and the full report should they wish to. As far as the literature review itself was concerned, we used search terms that were appropriate for the actual areas, so dysphagia or swallow with stars and so on, as and appropriate for the different databases that we were looking at. So sometimes you have to put slightly different search terms in to get what you're looking for. So looked for particular literature, did citation tracking so that it brought things up to the current present day, checked references from journal articles to go backwards, and the same sorts of things as anybody would always do when they were doing a literature search in the first place. We also looked at grey literature, so things that were unpublished, things that were professional links, things that people use but are not necessarily in the refereed journals. And some of the sample journal papers and books that we found are on this slide here. So particularly Pownall's work, Sheepway, Lincoln and McAllister, and of course, I think that McAllister reference is wrong actually. I think there's an S instead of a, is it not? There it is. Right, okay, well, we're fine in that case. But those references were the journal articles and papers. But we also found competency documents. And some of these things actually were quite surprising, because what we found was that things that people have been using as competency documents have never actually always been intended to be competency documents. And the King's one was one in particular. We had been seeing the King's College Hospital Trust document being used with speech and language therapy students and with new graduates as a competency document. When we spoke to people from King's, they said it was never intended to be that. So it's been adopted and adapted for use because there was nothing else available at the time. So it was something that was fit for purpose but being used beyond its original scope. The Bowden Interprofessional Dysphagia Framework is, well, what it says on the tin basically. It's designed for people who work with dysphagia, from care workers on through to specialist speech and language therapists. And we also found the RCSLT resource manual for commissioning and planning services, which is available online from the professional body, to be particularly useful. At this stage, and I will say this again later, the new RCSLT guidelines had not come out. This was looked at before those were published. We also looked at things from other areas. In Australia, there is a competency framework which is used across the country for speech and language therapists as undergraduates. And this is very well known, and it's also used in other parts of the Southern Hemisphere, and also one or two places in the UK have adopted it, but again, adapted it because it's an Australian area. The Republic of Ireland has got pre-registration curriculum guidelines already, and some of the pre-registration courses here were doing various things to develop dysphagia competence. And as I said, RCSLT guidelines were around, but they weren't published until December, and they weren't actually launched until April this year. So although we knew about them and we had copies of them, we weren't able to quote them until towards the end of the project. We interviewed dysphagia experts from around the UK, people from different backgrounds, so they did practice in learning disability, practice in paediatrics, practice in adult acquired, so that we've got ideas from them about what good practice was in speech and language therapy work with dysphagia. And the people that we could speak to face-to-face we did, and others we did a phone interview with, so we were fairly pragmatic about how we got that data. Some of these interviews were very long, and some of them perhaps slightly shorter, but I think probably you were looking at between 40 minutes and an hour, because speech therapists tend to talk. Very useful. From those two sources, we put together a pre-Delphi questionnaire. So we drew on the literature and we drew, I'm using my hands, sorry. We drew on the literature and we drew on the interviews to put together a questionnaire which investigated current competency developments in the northwest of England. So trying to find out what people actually already did, because you might as well start with what you've got rather than try and invent something from scratch. And we sent a qualitative survey out electronically. The university was using Qualtrics at the time. We would have probably preferred SurveyMonkey because that's a more easy-to-use approach. Qualtrics does a lot more data analysis, which was quite useful. But it went to all the speech and language therapy departments in the Northwest, so every speech therapist in the Northwest of England had the opportunity to respond to this questionnaire. And it went to all final year students on the Manchester courses at Manchester University and at this university. And that helped us to identify what people thought were barriers and also examples of good practice and effective models in developing competence. So this is still pre-Delphi, but it's working towards Delphi because it's drawing on the expert information that we've got going here. I'm just trying to keep my slides on track at the same time. So the question themes that came from the literature and the interviews were fairly basic. So we were looking at where people worked, what type of service they worked in, what their client groups were like, what they thought new graduates were like. That's quite telling because new graduates think differently from well-experienced people, I think. But there was a range of views within both the graduates, or the students, and within the respondents who were already qualified. But particularly we're interested in current practice, so how people were developing knowledge, how they viewed the formal postgraduate courses, and also how they developed skills, so what they were doing to develop skills, and what sorts of supervision, what methods were being used, who was doing it, and when it was happening. So looking at the sorts of service that we've got, 90%, over 90% of people were working in the National Health Service, which is well understood in the UK, but perhaps less so outside of the UK. 68% of the respondents who were qualified had got more than 2 years' experience. By definition, the undergraduates weren't yet. But it was 68% more than 2 years' experience, and I think the person that had been working longest that responded had been working around 35 years, so a lot of experience there. And in terms of the clinical caseload, there was a really wide range again. Paediatric, acute paediatric, chronic, adult, acute, adult, progressive adult chronic, adult stroke, adult learning disability, adult mental health. So there was a wide range of respondents. So we were actually drawing from everybody that we wanted to, which I think is quite important. If we go back to Lynston and Turriff, what they were saying is that we're not trying to get a quick response. So we're actually wanting people to think. Want to stimulate thought and consideration about what's usually a very complex question. Well, if you think about going back to the military, deciding who you bomb and when is actually quite a complex question because you've got lives at stake. You've still got lives at stake with dysphagia, although it's a very different sort of piece of work, because what you're trying to do is make sure that you don't choke somebody and that they are looked after by somebody that's competent. They were also trying to make people aware of how knowledge can be pooled and how people understand how other people understand things. So that's quite a complex sort of approach, really, I think. It's not just an easy fix. It's not fill in a questionnaire and here's the answer and now we know the answer. The beauty of it is that by the time you come to the end, because people are giving explanations about why they think something, you've got your report written as well, because you've got your justifications for what you've got from the raw data that people have sent back. So we did finally get onto the Delphi surveys, which is always a good thing when you're talking about Delphi and dysphagia. And the aim of the surveys were to get a consensus view of how dysphagia competency development could be supported across all those different clinical and geographical settings. We had people responding from as far north as Cumbria, out to the west coast of Cumbria, which is about as isolated as you can get in England, across as far as the Wirral, and out as far as the Pennines. And we think we've probably got a couple of responses from outside of the northwest as well, because we weren't restricting people, but that's what we got. Again, we used the electronic survey, we used Qualtrics, and I'll say a little bit about that at the end. We had intended to have up to 4 rounds, but in actual fact, by the time we got to the end of the second round, we'd got 75% consensus on most of what we were looking at. So the first round was consensus development 1, if you like, and this was asking people about different views on approaches to developing competence in dysphagia. We gave them a long list of questions, and there were spaces for free text as well, so that people could tick a box saying this is what we think is the best, or they could list things in order of preference, or they could say, we don't want to do any of this, we're already absolutely fine, which we did get from a couple of respondents, with big services, so they've got lots of opportunities to develop people in-house, through to we don't take Band 5 graduates because we're not going to train people up for them to leave, which is another view from certain areas. The responses came back, and then the second round incorporated the responses and the justifications into a redesigned and recirculated survey. So people were then being asked, this is what people have already told us, what do you think now? And the first round that we had, we didn't get huge amounts of consensus. It ranged from about, 50% was probably about the best on a lot of the questions that we got. The second round, the responses showed that people had changed their views. And it was sent round to the same respondent group. And people have got a lot more consensus, and again gave justifications, which is what the Delphi is about, is the complex bit rather than the simple. So at that point, excuse me, all the areas that got 75% consensus, we incorporated into a draft model and recommendations for how people could go forwards. I'll hold that up so that you can see it there. But the recommendations come in a form of a small brochure, and they also have a much longer document which we presented to the funders, and that we're in the process of writing up for publication as well at the moment. So some of the examples of where we did get consensus. 100% agreed that formal teaching should refresh newly qualified speech therapists, building on knowledge they've covered at undergraduate level, which is quite pleasing, really, that there was a recognition that we've got quite a substantial amount of knowledge at undergraduate level. Not all graduates will have practical experience of dysphagia at the moment, because it very much depends on the placements that they have, and currently dysphagia placements are not automatically part of undergraduate experience. 90% agreed or strongly agreed that newly qualified speech and language therapists should have a half day a week or pro rata for the first 6 months of protected competency development time. This is actually part of what is in the RCSLT guidelines for newly qualified therapists anyway, so it's quite good that people are happy about that, even in the time that we've got now, where there's huge pressure on service provision. 90% either agreed or strongly agreed that we should be using video more widely in developing competency, and nobody disagreed with that. So there are alternative ways to developing competence, to face-to-face, hands-on, doing the practical work. There are other things that people can be doing. And 95% agreed or strongly agreed that you did need some direct observation of practice before you could be absolutely sure that somebody was going to be safe to practice. So there was a wide range of how you did that, Some people thought that the formal courses were the way to do it because it was a one-shot and you were assessed and it was quality assured. Others, as I said, were quite happy to do it in-house themselves. Yes? Of course you can ask a question.
So, I just want to make sure I properly have understood the process. So you did your literature review and you talked to experts.
Yes.
And then they generated a set of statements
Those things generated a set of questions for people to respond to as a Delphi survey.
And they were sent out as questions or statements that people agreed or disagreed with?
They were sent out as do you disagree or agree with these
And then
statements.
the ones that lots of people disagree with, you throw out.
Well, you recirculate and say this is why people disagree, and then reformulate it, and then send it back out again. Yeah. Okay. You can ask all you like.
I just want to ask about the protected 3.5 hours a week.
Yes.
Presumably that is only for people who've got dysphagia as part of their caseload.
No, this was for new graduates. I mean, we were looking at dysphagia.
Okay.
The bit for new graduates is what's recommended for new graduates.
Yeah,
But this was about dysphagia. Yeah.
Yeah, but so if you were going into, say, a paediatric post that had no dysphagia or, you know, they're not saying that you should be developing that competency
As well.
even if you're not working with that client.
Oh, no.
Okay.
No.
Yeah.
So I'm saying everybody, all who qualified should have 3.5
Yes.
hours a week of competency
Yes.
development
For any competency.
Yes.
So yes,
Yes.
within that it could be dysphagia.
But this
It
is,
could
I
be
mean, this was
something
about
else.
dysphagia.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is how.
Okay.
Is somebody wanted to come in?
Hi,
Hello.
I'm so sorry I'm late.
That's okay. Right. We didn't get agreement on other things. Under for 50%, 47% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that in our setting, dysphagia caseload is covered by experienced speech and language therapists, not newly qualified speech and language therapists. So we've got a difference of opinion here. As I said, some people wouldn't let band 5s near people with dysphagia. So they wouldn't employ people to work with dysphagia at band 5. Other people said, well, why not? It's not any different from anybody else that's starting to work in a new field. You support everybody. Coming back to your point of a minute since, if you're a new graduate, you should be supported to move into whatever it is that you're working with regardless. Interesting questions on who was confident or lacking confidence, and we had a lot of comments along with this one. It wasn't just that you got a sort of yes-no answer. 28% of the respondents thought that supervisors can lack confidence in newly qualified speech and language therapists, which kind of links back to the other one a little bit, and be overcautious and risk-averse. But 38% didn't think that that was being risk-averse. And 19% suggested that newly qualified speech therapists can actually be overconfident and think that they know more than they know. So we didn't actually unpick that one because it was one that didn't reach any sort of consensus, and when we talked to people just to try and do some teasing out of it in other fora, we got exactly that sort of range of views. So it came to seem as though it wasn't going to be resolvable. So that was just an example. It's actually quite hard to see this model. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to turn around and look at the screen. I apologise. But this was the eventual model that we developed, that on graduation, speech and language therapists will have knowledge base to what's known as specialist level in the Bowden framework. Their practical experience will vary, and that the framework of competencies starts as a student, and continues throughout life. And actually, I've got one of our respondents here now, I think, so that's great. In the first year of work, then we'd be expecting people to work as a supervised therapist, developing professional skills, increasing their experience, extending their knowledge base. But it's the sort of skills that are the key there, because the knowledge base should be there already. They should have the knowledge to build their skills upon, and would require weekly supervision and informal support. And that comes from the RCSLT work from 2003 and the newly qualified therapist guidelines, as well as from these data that we were collecting. So it's good to see that there's a consensus with existing good practice guidelines, as well as what we've come out here. But although we weren't supposed to be looking at we were only supposed to be looking at newly qualified therapists, by definition, the responses that came back extended beyond the newly qualified speech and language therapists. And so we did put the rest of those graduates in. And this was, just going back to the first year of work, it's the first year of work with dysphagia that we're looking at. It's not just the first year of working, because some people will never work with dysphagia. Some people might go into it in the first day, and others might not be allowed to until they've got to a band 6 or whatever. But this is the first year of working with them. Second year of working with dysphagia. Becoming autonomous, supervision every second to fourth week, informal support, and the sort of monitoring and supervision might be direct or distance monitoring of practice at that stage. And then as people continued becoming independent in this field, developing to specialist level, supervision, as you would with anybody. If you were employing somebody, then you have to have supervision on a reasonably regular basis to make sure that you know that they know what they're doing. And as managers, I mean, I know that's a really important issue. And ongoing professional development. And I think at the moment the amount allowed is 5 days, isn't it? Something like that, which is about 30 hours a week. 30 hours. We took that model and shared it at the RCSLT Northwest Hub meeting, which is the professional body meeting which was held in April 2015. And what we tried to do there was not be in competition with, but trying to complement the RCSLT guidelines, which were launched at that meeting and are a really good resource because they've been developed for the profession across the piece, and they are very well established and very well thought through. And I think what we didn't want to do is look as though, yes, but we want to do something different, because that was completely not the point. And we also had a meeting with ProfNet, which is the Northwest Speech and Language Therapy Managers group, where we presented it and listened to comments before we actually completed the final model. And there were some slight tweaks, but not any major ones. Some fairly interesting challenges whenever you're trying to talk to people in the National Health Service. And mostly it's about National Health Service firewalls to anything electronic. Qualtrics is a very sophisticated approach to electronic surveying. And for a lot of people, they couldn't access it because the firewalls wouldn't let them open it. And so some of the supposedly online surveys ended up being done as a paper and pencil exercise over the phone with Susan Guthrie and a couple with John, so that because people had emailed and said, can't open it. This is something we took back to IT here, and they said, it isn't us. So I think that's something that we need to be aware of. If we're going to do something similar in the future, we need to find out from the NHS what can be accessed easily and quickly by everybody, because there's no point in trying to do a survey that people can't access. As it happened, people were very positive about it, and if they couldn't access it, they told us. So we did get the responses that we were looking for, but it could have fallen over completely. And that's probably going to be the same with any other group of people who are working in sensitive areas where they've got a lot of confidential material that needs to be protected. So I'm not saying it shouldn't happen. I'm just saying that we need to be cuter about how we deal with it. We did find some very strongly held and mutually exclusive views across the profession. We didn't really think it was our job to resolve those. We respect the fact that people have got very different views, and it comes from their own experiences. So some people really do believe quite firmly that you shouldn't be doing anything with dysphagia until you've been working for X number of years. Others believe quite firmly that once you're qualified, you should be able to hit the ground running with anything that comes at you once you've got the job in that area. Some people felt very strongly that you had to have postgraduate formal training before you were qualified. Other people were quite happy to say, we can do it without that. It was interesting to try and square that circle.
I was just going to say, but even with that, you still got your 75% consensus.
For
so that allowed...
Yeah, I mean, the consensus that we got took account of these varying views in terms of what we recommended, how you did what you did, as opposed to what you did. So one of the things that we were suggesting was how people went around. Well, I'll come to the slide in a second, actually. So, yes, so here we are. So in terms of recommendations, we had 5 particular themes, and they were around these 5 areas. Firstly, what postgraduate formal training needs there were. And there's no question that all of us need postgraduate formal training from time to time, whether it's about dysphagia or whether it's about something else. You don't just stop at the end of university and learn nothing else, I hope. The development of practical skills, and here that was where there was a wide variation of not what needed to be developed, but how it could be done. And as I say, there are suggestions in these booklets that we've got. Suggestions about supervision, again, not that it needs to be done, but how it could be done, so that it can be accommodated in West Cumbria or in central Manchester in the ways which are appropriate for the various services, or indeed North Lancashire. There were recommendations for workforce planning, because one of the things was about supervision and it was about skills development. And in order to enable people to move through those skills, there needs to be some top-down recognition of folk needing time to do it, and not expect students to come out ready cooked for absolutely everything, because they do develop. And that, I know, is a challenge, particularly at the moment with the financial constraints that people are under. And one of the big things that came out most was that the clinical excellence networks were a really good source of support, because they're bottom up. They're from people that are actually on the ground doing the work, but have got a particular interest. They're what used to be called special interest groups for speech and language therapy. They're now called clinical excellence networks, partly because they've moved their remit and they are trying to develop clinical excellence, and partly because if you call them that, then they are regarded better by people who are releasing staff to go and do it. So there's a little bit of it's pragmatic, but most of it is actually definitely to promote professional good practice. So the full report is available on the North West Allied Health Profession website. You might find that you have to sign into that if you are not already a member in order to access it. The full report is really quite long. It's called The Big Picture. As well as dysphagia competency in the North West, not just the big picture. And then there's the wee brochure, which is a 4-page brochure, which has got some of the nice graphics there that we've got on there as well. We've got an article accepted in the RCSLT bulletin, which won't appear until next April, because they seem to have a lot of stuff coming at the moment, which talks a little bit more about this. And as I said, we're working towards writing this up for academic publication as well. I'm speaking to the paediatric special interest group, I'm doing it again, this paediatric clinical excellence network in a couple of weeks about this, and so it'll be interesting to know how they take. I mean, we launched it in June here, and I think we had about 50, 60 people came to that launch. You would be at that, I think, wouldn't you, Henry? Were you not? What a shame. Yes, yes. It was actually very, very dynamic because people were really interactive, but very positive about it, recognising what the challenges still are, of course. We have to thank Henry because we wouldn't have been able to do it without them. We have to actually thank Profnet as well, because it wouldn't have happened if Profnet hadn't have said that they wanted it to be happening. And, of course, everybody else that supported. The steering group included a service user who was absolutely fantastic, speech and language therapy in people who worked with dysphagia in each of the major groups, so children, adults, learning disabilities. We had a representative from the other university, Manchester University, so that it was seen as being a Northwest product rather than somebody from one university saying this is what it is. And of course everybody that responded, because you can't do this sort of thing. You certainly can't do Delphi unless people actually sent something back. So we've got Delphi references, well, some of the references there, I'm sure I don't need to go through all of them, but I would commend the RCSLT 2014 framework, because I think it's a real step forward for the profession. I would also commend ours, of course, but they do work in tandem. They're not contradictory. And that's me. This is the next one, so that's up to you, Julia.